Alright, so today I'm gonna go over a little things I did in the last couple days. So right now I still have this default picture, but now if I hit the right key, it can move. You see these little outlines here? That's for the Box 2D body stuff that I'm going to go over later. I can move up, left, right. I'll show how I handled input a bit later. It's not bad. Here's the border of my screen. I can change the resolution of my game pretty easily, so it's not a big deal. I can move left in like any type of direction. Right? I was working on rotation, but it's a sort of difficult thing to try, and I'm not ready to show it yet. Another thing I can do is I can alter the magnitude, like at whim. I'm hitting S. Now instead of moving like this, I move like that. Difference like that compared to that. So now that's like a little sprint button, like how in Minecraft you hit double right to sprint, you just hit like that to sprint. I can alter it to make it a double tap as well. But yeah, that's basically it. It's not much. A lot of the things I've been doing is planning, because I plan to try and integrate some infinite world type generation with Box 2D as well, which can be somewhat inefficient, and I'll go over that. Okay, so what I'm going to go for is a type of grid. Grid. Because, well, I'll be able to move anywhere inside that grid. I want each thing to be like its own little tile. That makes pathfinding a lot easier. As for example, if I'm like right here, I can just tell my controller to find my tile, which would be this guy, and then it can pathfind to some other tile, which would be that guy. I wouldn't have to do a direct pathfind from one point to another point. Oh, my cursor is very small. But that brings in some issues. For example, what is the way I'm going to render my tiles? Am I going to make them all entities and then put them into my engine and give them a render component with their own sprite? You know, that doesn't sound like such a bad idea. However, this is only 7 by 5. That's 35 entities. That's more than all. Actually, in my engine, I only have one entity, and that's a player. But for example, what if it's like, if I'm going infinite style, if it'd be like 10 million times 10 million, which would be 10 million squared. Oop, that's outside my screen. 10 million squared, that's, I don't know, 10 times 10 to the 6, that's 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 14th, maybe? That's a whole bunch of entities, and that's not very good, not very nice. So, how am I going to solve it? What I could do is have like a 2D array of tiles. That's what I did in my last tile game. Just a 2D array like that. Ignore the drawing, where each tile is like its own object, and I just render it. However, what if there are certain situations where I want a tile to be an entity? And like by doing that, by having a separate array, I'm sort of like not using the features of the entity component system. For example, if I want a water tile, let's denote it as a W. This tile should be animated like water is, but my player is also going to be animated, so I'm probably going to make an animated component. Do I want to make an animation component for my player and not use the same one for my water? Isn't that sort of a waste, you may ask? Or that's what I was thinking, at least. And yeah, that's right, it is a waste. I'm going to have to do double everything. One for my player and every dynamic body, and one for my tile. My other idea is, what if instead of having a tile array solely and like splitting it up from the entity component system, have a tile array with like blank areas, like a null value for entities. I'm writing with a mouse, so bear with me. And maybe some information for non-entities else. For example, in my tile array, say like everything else, this is grass, and it has no like interesting features. It's just grass. Maybe I'll color it in with some green. It's just grass, and then my water will be animated, so it'll change like every couple seconds or something. I'll put two colors there to denote it. So for tiles with no real like need to be an entity besides the render component, perhaps just render those separately, and then in the tiles that are interesting, that would be like animated or have specific properties like collision, then those aren't rendered. Those are left for the engine to render. So this is sort of a bad explanation. Let me try and go over it a bit more. So in the case that it is not an entity, like right here, just render. That's it. But if that specific tile happens to be an entity, its value in the 2D array will be null. And if it is null, it just won't draw anything. Nothing. It'll appear like black or whatever I refresh the screen to. And then later, oh, I don't have any space. In the engine, because that tile is inside the engine, tile, that's off my screen as well. Because my tile is inside the engine, it will be rendered again, or it'll be rendered by the engine instead of in this separate 2D array render call. And because of how rendering works, like all these things will be rendered first, like this, like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's rendered on the first pass. Then on the second pass, my water is rendered. Yeah, that sounds pretty interesting, right? So basically, if any, like an entity is, or any tile is like anything but blank, then it will just be rendered like on the second draw call. I think that is the way I want to go about it too. I'm not quite sure, because I do know that if I were to make all of them entities, like all the tiles entities, I would be able to have a much more complex system, because I could add behavior to each entity or each tile, but that would be a big waste as well, because I'd be wasting some, or whatever tiles aren't like very unique, I'll be wasting that memory and that behavior, because I'm giving behavior to something that doesn't need it. And I also have to think about scalable as well. Like this game's going to be very large. So if I were to do that entity solution where everything is an entity, I'd have to figure out a way to dynamically load entities as I move away from the tiles. Like if the tiles are not renderable, or if the tiles are not rendered on the screen, I don't want the engine like looping over it. So it's a very interesting problem, and I'll probably figure out a solution in the next day, at max maybe a week. But let's get on to the other stuff. Okay, so the magic starts here in the player controlled component class. Basically, that's just like a flag that tells my entity component system that, oh, this entity should be controlled through this amount of logic. I add it to my player right here. Okay, so player input move system right there. So basically, it takes in an input handler, which I'll go over, but it requires just the player controlled component class. And then I use some methods for my input handler, and I create a move component using new, which is a pretty bad practice. I'm going to have to switch over to pooling later, but for now I just wanted to use new just to show some stuff off. The reason why it's bad is because I create it every time this process entity method is done. So basically it says if the input handler, like if the keys input left, right, and down or up are pressed, then create a new move component with a magnitude of 5. And this is for the extra speed boost. Set the speed magnitude to 10. but basically add standard basis vectors and their complements or opposites to the move component, and then afterwards normalize it. Let's go to move component. This is actually something that you shouldn't really have in an entity component system, but that's logic within your components. That's generally a bad practice, but I'm doing it because it simplifies a lot of stuff. So I have some constructors here. One that takes in a velocity and a speed magnitude, and the other one that just takes in a speed magnitude. Velocity we set to 0, 0 on default, and this one has some velocity. Okay, I can actually, instead of this, I can just put this vector 2 and speed magnitude, and it does the same thing basically. It's using this constructor up here. Okay. So now let's go on to move system, and then we'll finish up with the input handler. This was for like some friction stuff I was testing out. But basically it gets a move component. Oh no, in order to go over this I have to go over box 2D. That's going to be a little tough. But it basically gets its move component, which has its velocity and stuff inside it. And then gets the physics component, which is the box 2D part. And then just sets its velocity right here to the move component's velocity. Let's take a look at physics component. It just has a box 2D body, which for all intents and purposes is like something that can have forces applied to it and can have physics stuff applied to it. Yeah, okay. So let's head over to input handler. This is a pretty basic class. It doesn't use any libraries. I just made it like myself. The big part is the key array here. It's a hash map of integer and key, because the way libGDX has the keys, they're stored as ints, and that's not, well, ints can't be put into a data structure like this. I could make one, like a custom one. You know, I might make a custom one later, but for now I just chose to make hash map. And that's somewhat inefficient because of something called auto boxing, where when I put an int into this hash map, it has to create an integer object each time to access the keys inside the hash map, which is not ideal. I'll have to fix that later. But anyway, it's an input processor, which libGDX gives key events and stuff. In the game screen, I register it right here. So that means it sends input events to this guy. So in the key down, I go like, okay, if there's a key there, if there's a key at that certain spot in the hash table or hash map, I could actually do this through an array, but whatever. If there is one, then just set it to true. If there's not, then put one there, put a new key, and that's just basically like a holder for a key code, and it has a isPressed method, which tells if it's pressed. So if there's not one, then put one there, and then set the press to true. And this is basically just for libGDX purposes, to say if the event is handled or not. I just usually leave it at false, because when I put it to true, bad stuff started happening. Sorry, I can't go into more detail about that. Okay, and key up. Well, the thing is, key up can only occur if key down occurred, so at that point I know there's got to be a key there in the key array, so I just set it to false. Key typed, nothing there. And touchdown, this is for the mouse position. I have a vector 2 with a mouse click position, just basically puts it there. And if it's touched up, then I just set it to null. So basically, if there's been a click, it'll have a mouse position. But if not, then it'll just be a null. I could have a vector 2 saying last clicked position, but I'll add that functionality if I need it later. It's pretty simple. So now I have a method here called isKeyPress. Basically, I just do a type of Boolean flag thing, say if any of them are pressed, or actually no, this is key pressed with is this key pressed. So I just check the key array, and yeah. Oh, yeah, I check if it's null first, then I return it. I can set the key value manually. I can check if any keys are pressed. This is through a Boolean flag. Basically, if any key is pressed, just return. Um, this is actually I don't like that. You see, the thing about it is you don't want to go for inverse method calls. You'd rather go for just regular method calls and invert them if you need to. So I'll just do that right now. So if a key is not pressed, return true. Actually, if a key is pressed, return true. What am I talking about? Otherwise, return false. Okay, now I need to move my screen down a little bit. Okay, oh, and then I have this nifty thing here with this thing, this notation, which basically allows you to pass in an array, or basically just a long chain of stuff separated by commas, without having to make an array. So then I have like a list here, and I just check that list and see if any of those keys are pressed. I use that some player input move system, where I basically just pass in this list of keys, which is pretty good. Anyway, that's probably it for input handling. Okay, so that tile system I mentioned before, I actually managed to implement it. Isn't that nice? But I'll save the explanation for another time, because this one is getting a bit too long, and I don't really want to make these videos too long, because it takes a while to render and everything. So I guess I'll see y'all next time I post. Thanks for watching.